Welcome. This is another lecture in my History of New Orleans series, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Anthony Stanonis, who is a historian of New Orleans and also a historian from New Orleans. And we'll be speaking today largely about material from his first book, which is called Creating the Big Easy: New Orleans and the Emergence of Modern Tourism, 1918 to 1945. Welcome, Anthony. Nice
Hi,
to have you here.
great to be here.
Great. I think probably the last time that you and I spoke was probably in New Orleans
Oh
a
no,
couple
I
of
think
years
it
ago
was. We were
at a convention.
restaurant. Yeah, yeah.
So, it all ties in. So I wanted to focus today on that period in the 1920s and the 1930s where tourism in a sort of modern form really begins to take off and become an important part of the city's economy and the city's life. There'd always been visitors to New Orleans and people writing about it and people coming there for various reasons, but that begins to sort of change the shape and character in this period. What I was wondering is if we could start out talking a little bit about the New Orleans Association of Commerce, which is a really important organization in making this change. And a little bit, I thought one of the things that was particularly interesting was the sort of politics of that and how that emerges out of the New Orleans Progressive Union. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about where the New Orleans Association of Commerce sits in the sort of what they were and what they were trying to do, but also where they sit within the political environment of the city in the 1920s and 1930s.
The Association of Commerce really is an organization that's born out of the shifting of economy of New Orleans, right? Where, as you say, the New Orleans economy had largely been commercial, small industrial sector, but increasingly by the early 20th century, tourism was becoming more important. So hotels were becoming more important. All the things that fuel those hotels, grocers, for instance, and the food supply chain, those industries were growing in importance. So the Association of Commerce sort of reflected, as it's developed from the Progressive Union, a more diverse economic sector within New Orleans. And the Association of Commerce, as the very word association means, right? It's a more diverse body than, say, the union. There's a whole language debate about what those various things means, a union versus an association. But an association was this more diverse approach to the economy. And one of the things that, if you look at the records of the Association of Commerce, their bulletin and their, particularly their minutes, you see a very intense struggle within the Association of Commerce between those that are tied to the hospitality sector and those of the old school, traditional, commercial, industrial sector about where the city government should put investment, where the business leaders should put investment, what infrastructure is important. Is it roads? Is it the river? Obviously, the hospitality sector was leaning more and more towards roads and focusing on the railroad, but increasingly over the decades of the early 20th century on roads because of the rise of automobile travel, whereas the commercial sector was focused still very much on the river. They could have some agreement on railroads, but the river was much more important to that commercial sector because of this long historical association with the river as the key to trade within New Orleans. And so there's this real intense rivalry within the Association of Commerce between those two sectors, the hospitality and the industrial commercial. And that filters over into the political. Where does the city government put its focus, right? Which side are they on? And I think the key figure there is Martin Berman, because Martin Berman leaned more towards the hospitality sector and the tourism sector. He's a fascinating political character. We don't know as much about him as you would expect because he's the longest serving mayor in the history of New Orleans. He's one of the most powerful mayors in the United States in the early 20th century. He's born in 1864, so he's doesn't have a long tie to New Orleans because he's coming from German Jewish immigrant stock. So it's not this old money, old blood New Orleans. He comes up, he's orphaned fairly young. He grows up partly in Algiers, which is the side of the city across the river from the main body of the city. So he's sort of an outsider as an orphan, as somebody growing up in Algiers, partly in the French Quarter as well. But he really gets tied into the political scheme in Algiers, which is a unique place. It's like a city within a city because of the river divide. And in the 1890s, about the mid 1890s, there's a major fire and most of Algiers burns down. And it sort of gives Berman's career a shift because Algiers becomes sort of the first place where progressive ideas take hold because the whole neighborhood has to be rebuilt. And that gives Berman a perspective. He's working in the grocery industry, but he becomes increasingly involved in politics in Algiers. And so he sort of merges the commercial side and the hospitality sector side through his own personal experience, because obviously docks were very important in Algiers, but he has this other view of rebuilding the city, and he brings those ideas into the city government when he's first elected. I think it's like 1900, right around the turn of the century. And he stays pretty much mayor up until his death in like 1927, 26, 27, with one term where he's booted out by a reformer, who then gets booted out by Berman 4 years later. But yeah, that's, Berman's sort of the key figure in negotiating those two sides, and really giving the political emphasis to hospitality within the Association of Commerce and the city government.
Yeah, I think that I think Berman is, as you say, one of the most fascinating and understudied figures. There's no biography of him out there. There's, as far as I know, unless there's been one written in the past couple of years, there's just a series of memoirs that he published in the local newspaper that have been sort of edited into a kind of coherent narrative. But yeah, fascinating figure.
Yeah, there's very few, even if the mayor's papers are at the public library, there's very few letters from the Berman administration. Which makes you wonder what was in those letters, right? Because he was a very astute political manipulator. I mean, he's a city boss.
Yeah.
And it's really striking how few documents are around about it.
I've worked in those papers a little bit for the sort of early 1910s. And yeah, there's very little there, and there's probably a good reason for that. In fact, there was I think it was a master's thesis in the 1930s about city government and politics in that period, where the student had interviewed a lot of the ward bosses and stuff like that. And that's a really good source. But yeah, it's short of going into other things, I don't know, maybe the city council minutes and just a lot of newspaper research. But yeah, I suspect there was a fire someplace, that burned up a lot of things that people didn't need to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting about the sort of way this one political figure sort of bridges those two sort of sides of the economy. To shift towards sort of culture and sort of public perception, can you tell us a little bit about the bit you write about Sherwood Anderson and others? What role did writers and sort of public cultural figures play in trying to shift popular understandings of the city and what the city should be doing more towards sort of embracing sort of leisure and tourism?
Yes. Well, much of that has to do with the popular image of New Orleans. It goes back to the mid 19th century of New Orleans as a French outpost, right? And the view of the French Quarter as, you know, the old part of the city that maintained the French and Spanish heritage of, you know, this colonial past. And coming out of the First World War and the questioning of modernism and you know, the deadly results of progress, there's an artistic element, a literary element, but also painters, sculptors who find themselves in the French Quarter and migrate to the French Quarter to go back to this supposed simpler time. Sherwood Anderson is one of those key literary figures who migrates from Ohio down to New Orleans and embraces this sort of French lifestyle of decadence and enjoying life away from the hustle and bustle of 1920s American business, right? The Babbitts of, you know, Sinclair Lewis fame, of the American sort of so fixated with business. Here you can go to the French Quarter in New Orleans and live a more leisurely human life, right? And Sherwood Anderson, because of his prominence as a literary figure in the early 1920s, was a natural magnet for other budding writers, the most famous of which is William Faulkner. But other people like William Spratling, who eventually goes on as a famous silversmith in Mexico. So there's all these little artists who are congregating in the French Quarter, celebrating what they imagine is the French Creole past of a simpler lifestyle. And as they write, right, and as they promote this ideal, it helps attract tourists who want to experience that lifestyle. And so they really give a leg up to the hospitality industry and the tourism industry, and the reimagining of New Orleans as this other space, you know, that you can go to and sort of escape the chaos of modern business and modern technology. Right? And we have to think of, you know, the 1920s with all the impact of the mass-produced automobile and, you know, electricity being more widely available, so that, you know, you have more telephones, you have, you know, electric lights, and you have radio. You have all these new technologies that were changing society. And so there's an urge within American culture of the 1920s to go back in time to this idea of the simpler time. And New Orleans became one of those meccas, sort of a refuge from modernity, where you could sort of leave your job for a week or so and go on a vacation. And those writers played a role in that.
That's really interesting, especially because some of them, like Faulkner, are people that we think of as modernist writers in a way. So there's really interesting sort of literary sides to that. To come back to something that we mentioned in passing, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the role of conventions, not least because, for instance, the Southern Historical Association is scheduled to meet in New Orleans for its convention, as it does every few years, in November of 2021. Hopefully that will work out. But conventions were something that New Orleans had for quite a while. And I was wondering, as I read, I was thinking, in a way, there's sort of, you know, what we would call over here in Britain, a busman's holiday, right? They're sort of leisure, and they're also sort of work. And is there a way in which conventions sort of served as a sort of halfway point, or maybe a transitional sort of phase between the idea of thinking of New Orleans as a city devoted to commerce and industry, and thinking of it as a city devoted to tourism?
Yeah. I would definitely say that conventions are halfway, right? There's a couple of things going on with conventions, right? They're easy for a wedding of the hospitality sector and the industrial commercial sector because they're countable. Right? And this is a big deal that comes up in the 1920s and 30s. Right? Because conventions, you have set numbers and you can see and tally where people are coming from, how many people are coming, you can actually assess the economic impact. Hotel rooms, banquets, so on and so forth. So everyone could see what the benefit was. So conventions were really good, and everyone could agree that conventions are useful. Part of what's interesting about the 1920s, and it shows how conventions are a halfway point, one of the contentions between those two sectors of the New Orleans economy was when the automobile comes along, how do you count? People may be on a road trip from Florida to Texas or Florida to California and experiencing the fun of and the adventure of the automobile, and they may only stop in New Orleans for 5 hours, right? As they're passing through. How do you evaluate what the economic impact is of tourism when you only have people there for a few hours? So the Association of Commerce, for instance, sends people out to actually count the license plates of automobiles parked on Canal Street and do like weekly tallies to find out where most of the tourists come. Most tourists come from the state of Illinois, primarily Chicago, as they come down the river, the old traditional railroad route, but they start to use automobiles. So that's, it's also the origins of the bumper sticker, because the Association of Commerce would also stick a "I've been to New Orleans" sort of bumper sticker on cars without permission, as they saw, foreign cars parked on Canal Street. So conventions served a very good transition point, halfway point, because they're countable and you can do the economic impact, whereas automobile and general tourism, you couldn't. The other thing about conventions, I'd say, is they're associated with industry, but one of the things that isn't fully appreciated about conventions, and something that I've gotten more and more into since I wrote my book, are the wives who come with the businessmen to the conventions. And right now I'm working on, as I've mentioned before, talking to you, I'm working on a book on pralines. And one of the things that's really been interesting is how at these conventions, the men would go do the business side of things, and the wives would have their own banquet, right? And they would often go on plantation tours, or they would be the ones who would be taken on a tour of the French Quarter. So on one hand, you have the businessmen sitting in the banquet hall, having their business meetings, and the wives are the ones who are going through what is now the sort of traditional tourism sector, right? And maybe those conventions would end with a steamboat banquet, right? Where the men and their wives would see the port of New Orleans, so the businessmen see all the modern conveniences, and the women are packaged this sort of old South magnolia and cotton image of the city, right? And so there's like two different images of the cities that are being played in the early 20th century. There's this modern city that the men are being given by the local business community, and this romanticized city that the women who are coming to New Orleans are being given by the Association of Commerce. And so that's something I've been exploring more and more, because most of the writings about conventions have been about the businessmen, and the wives are sort of ignored. You don't really think about them as much in the literature, which is surprising in 2020 that more hasn't been written about this. But it's a major part of the convention trade and that transition point of where tourism is moving.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As you say, it's a bit surprising that in 2020, we've been used to thinking about gender in history for a long, long time. But it's interesting that, in some ways, we're not thinking about that, or only just starting to think about it in those ways, with this sort of intersection of tourism history and business history and so forth. But what we obviously need is a book about pralines, because the research for that, I'm sure, will be very interesting.